Is it working? Is it on? Yeah? Yeah. Hey, everybody. It's so good to see so many people here. This is incredible. Just want to thank everyone for coming out. I know we advertised this like just a few days ago, so seeing this many faces is, yeah, it's just really incredible. Thank you for being here. I also want to thank the People's Forum for having us. They've been showing up in such an incredible way. And thank you for organizing this and getting everything set up for us. Round of applause for the People's Forum. Okay. And then before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that on November 4th, which is this Saturday, we're marching on the White House. We're having a march in DC that is definitely going to be of historic proportions. There's going to be, at the very least, 100,000 people there, and we hope to see you all there. We hope you can all join us. And we have 3 key demands, which are ending the ceasefire, lifting the siege, and ending all, or not ending the ceasefire. Oh my God, what am I talking about? It's been a long week. Calling for a ceasefire, lifting the siege, ending all U.S. Funding for Israel. So November 4th, please be there. All right, let's see if this works. It's working? Okay. It was buzzing. Is that normal? Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, so my name is Miriam. I'm here with the Palestinian Youth Movement, and we are a transnational grassroots independent movement of Palestinian and Arab youth who are fighting for the liberation of our homelands from the forces of Zionism and imperialism. And we believe that our role here in the diaspora is to mobilize our communities and stand firmly with our people in Palestine as they struggle against Zionist crimes. And when our people in Palestine rise up, and when our people all across the Arab world rise up, we insist on rising up where we are too, in the locations where we live. It's important for us to demonstrate our commitment to our people's liberation from Zionist colonization and show the world that we've not abandoned our cause or our people. Both historically and today, the diaspora has been really pivotal in popular mobilization, and we, as the Palestinian Youth Movement, continue that today. So we hope to build community power and have strong, engaged communities in service of our people and our struggle. We also, thank you. I'll point it that way. I'm telling you guys, it's been a long week. The Palestinian Youth Movement also upholds the full and unconditional right to resist of the Palestinian people against colonial domination and racist occupation. We reject the concern that we are only allowed to be victims of colonial violence. Instead, we support the struggle of the oppressed for liberation, and we rise up with courage in this moment to join our forces with people all around the world who are breaking free from the shackles of colonialism. So over the past few weeks, I'm sure you guys have seen the mobilizations that we've had all across the US and Canada and in Britain too, condemning Israel's genocide in Gaza and standing with the brave people of Gaza. All right.
Okay, so we're gonna just do a very quick grounding, but the purpose of this teach-in, there's a lot obviously to talk about. We've had sessions in the past of like gone 100 years of Palestinian history, and We're not even going to be covering everything that's going on now or even the entire history of Gaza, but trying to kind of equip you all with a framing and understanding in order to understand, to comprehend what's going on now and, why we have the demands that we do and also what your role can be here. So I'm going to just give a quick grounding over the last, of what's been happening over the last 3 weeks, which I'm sure most of you guys know a bit about. So we have witnessed in the last 3 weeks a mass genocide unfold in Gaza. Since October 7th, there's been over 8,300 people living in Gaza who've been martyred, and I wrote this number yesterday, so I'm not sure, every 5 minutes there is a martyr. So the number has probably risen, and it includes upwards of 4,000 children who make up almost 42% of the martyrs. In the West Bank as well, there's been over 100 Palestinians, mainly youth, who have been martyred as they resist the occupation. And at the same time, over the last 3 weeks, while Israel has been carrying out mass arrests of Palestinians across all of historic Palestine, adding to the already hundreds of administrative detainees who are Palestinians held in Zionist prisons without charge. And as of this moment, there are over 10,000 Palestinians being held hostage in Zionist prisons. And this doesn't even include the hundreds of workers from Gaza who were essentially kidnapped after October 7th when they were inside historic Palestine, and they were kidnapped and are being tortured and detained. So in Gaza, the Zionist enemy in the last 3 weeks has dropped over thousands of tons of bombs on entire residential complexes, hospitals, schools, places of worships, telecommunication lines. We've seen multiple total blackouts in Gaza a few days ago and also yesterday. And with an average of 33 tons of explosives per square kilometer as of last week. So as of last week, the amount of tons of bombs dropped on Gaza had already surpassed the tonnage of the nuclear bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the murderous US state. And it's only increasing. Israel continues to carry out war crimes with the direct help of Western imperialist governments, targeting journalists, medics, civilians, supposedly safe roads and sites, and the Rafah border crossing, preventing vital aid from entering from Egypt. Entire generations of families have been totally wiped out. This most recent assault in Gaza is by far the deadliest, but the people of Gaza have also witnessed mass genocide campaigns in 2009 and 2014, with a total of 6 wars since 2005. At the same time, across the world, we have seen a mass outpouring of people taking to the streets to show their support for Palestine, from the millions that gathered in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and even Egypt, where we know we haven't seen protests since 2011, essentially, to the hundreds of thousands across Europe and the Americas, in Britain, Italy. And despite attempts at repression, even thousands gathered in France and Germany. In contrast, there have barely been a handful of protests for Israel, with the majority of support concentrated amongst the ruling class, which we're going to get into a bit, understanding why that is. And so this reveals more clearly than ever what we all already knew to be true, that the masses are with Palestine, that Palestinians are waging a people's war, a struggle for oppressed people, a struggle for all revolutionaries, for all people who seek true liberation and justice from the forces of Zionism and global imperialism. Israel is able to launch this relentless bombing campaign against the people of Gaza with complete impunity because it enjoys the political, diplomatic, and military support of the US, Canadian, and British governments, as well as other the European Union and other American and imperialist allies. After all, Israel is a central asset for the Western world, and what we are seeing is state powers protecting their interests in the Arab world and the region more broadly.
So today we hope to really dive into that and learn more about that specifically, about imperialism. But whoa, you guys,
actually speaking to them. Can everyone hear us in the back when we speak into them? Okay.
You got just like a preview of our entire presentation.
Wait, go, close your eyes.
Yeah, please. Don't ruin the surprise. You'll click for me.
Okay, wait, quick show of hands. Who's coming to the DC March? Wow.
Nice.
Not enough. Everyone's hand needs to be up, but you guys still have time. If you have any questions about how to get there, come talk to us afterwards. Or look at the People's Forum's buses website. Okay.
Okay. So just to ground our session today, I want to run through our objectives and what we think is most important to learn and take away from this session. So the first is to understand the relationship between Zionism and imperialism. So here we need to understand that Zionism serves the interests of the imperial powers, and it's sustained through them in an effort to maintain dominance over the Arab world and profit from the region's resources. Our second objective is to historicize the Zionist project in order to understand its genocidal character or nature. By definition, Zionism is a genocidal project. And the genocide that we're seeing in Gaza today isn't just limited to this moment, but it's been happening for over 75 years. Third, we aim to understand the history of the popular cradle in Gaza and popular resistance there. And in this, we need to understand that it's the masses of dispossessed people in Gaza who are leading the struggle and who are shouldering the largest burden for our collective liberation. And then finally, we need to take responsibility for our task here in the US. We need to understand that here we have a critical role to play by demanding an end to all funding to Israel, an immediate ceasefire, and to lift the blockade, which again, on November 4th, we'll do together. Next slide. Am I still not allowed to touch this? Okay, great. Okay, so before we dive into this, I just have a question, and raise your hand or just shout it out if you can. Do we have mics? No. Yeah, take it away. Okay, can anyone tell me what the Palestinian people are fighting for? Sovereignty? Land back? Yeah. Self-determination? Fall of imperialism? Yeah, you guys have got this. Great. This is going to be an easy session. Yeah, so Palestinians are fighting for the liberation of their lands, for the ability to return to their lands, for dignity and liberation and self-determination, and for an end to the Zionist colonial project. Okay, so here's a little thought experiment. What do the opponents of the Palestinian struggle, so you can think of that as like the mainstream media, US politicians, or the ruling class, what do the opponents of the Palestinian struggle say that the struggle is about? Sorry? Terrorism, yeah. Mm-hmm, yep. Yep. What was that? Religion? Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what we see from the opponents of the Palestinian struggle is this understanding of the struggle that completely obscures what it's actually about, right? So to get into that, what we're going to do today is distinguish between two frameworks for understanding this struggle. There's one framework that we call the idealist framework, which is what, sorry, we don't have a slide for that, which is what these opponents use, right? So for them, what you'll hear is an argument that Israelis and Palestinians, they just can't get along, right? That they have differences in core values, like one group are terrorists and one group are fighting for democracy, or that, you know, it's a religious conflict between Jews and Muslims. This is exemplified by, there was a tweet that the Israeli Prime Minister deleted shortly after tweeting, where he said, quote, "This is a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle," right? So we can see how this framework, this idealist framework, is so dangerous because it intentionally obscures the root causes of what's happening, which are settler colonialism and imperialism. And it also limits the horizon of what is considered an acceptable solution to what's happening, right? So in this framework, the colonizers are allowed to wage war, they're allowed to do whatever they want, but when it comes to the colonized, the only acceptable thing is to have dialogue and understanding, right? So we completely reject this framework, and instead we are going to employ a materialist framework in this teaching, which means that we're going to understand the actual material reasons of what's happening in Palestine. And what we mean by that is an understanding that this is a historical struggle over land and resources, and it's related to imperialist interests and geopolitical goals in the entire region. And through this, we can understand the actual objective reality, both historically and today in Palestine, as well as the Palestinian resistance and the Arab masses as historical agents of struggle who are in charge of their own liberation. So in this way, we can see how Zionism is a product of European imperialism and is driving a settler colonial project in Palestine. And we can understand that in this situation, the only way that change is going to come is through a struggle between the colonizer and the colonized. That's the only way that change will come. Okay, so this should be easy. With this framework in mind, what are the forces that are currently oppressing Palestinians and keeping them in their colonial condition? Can you name these forces? Capitalism, the West, occupation. Yes, okay, today we're going to highlight two of them, and they are deeply connected, and they are Zionism and imperialism. These are the main forces Palestinians are fighting against. Can I use this now?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, so Zionism is a, before I actually get into this, just want to say, I'm just going to quickly go through what we're talking about here as a kind of framing for the rest of the teaching, okay? So Zionism is a fascist movement and ideology that was born in the late 1800s in Europe. And it was a movement that was led by the bourgeoisie, who partnered with European powers to gain their favor and gain their support. And it believed in establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. So when we're talking about Zionism, there's a major Zionist myth that we want to dispel here, right? And this myth keeps coming up today. And the myth is that Zionism supposedly was the only solution to European anti-Semitism, right? But in reality, there had already been really strong movements of leftist Jews in Europe who were actively fighting anti-Semitism. And it was Zionism that emerged actually as a right-wing movement in response to that left. And they intentionally destroyed revolutionary and socialist elements of among European Jews. In some cases even, Zionists actually worked against militant anti-fascist Jewish resistance against the Nazis because their goal was again to eliminate the left elements among European Jewry. So we really need to understand that Zionism developed as a reactionary political ideology, and it developed in alignment with and secured the interests of the European ruling class. And in addition to that, contrary to what Zionists would like you to think, Zionism is also an inherently colonial ideology and movement. From the very start, Zionism and British imperialism went hand in hand, right? So for the British, they saw the creation of a Zionist state as a way to secure their interests in the region. And also they were anti-Semitic, so it was also a convenient way for them to say, you know, remove Jewish people from Europe, right? So we can see the connections there between Zionism and imperialism. So after 1916, you know, when the European powers drew the borders of the Middle East, Britain basically wanted to make sure that Palestine was under its control because of its strategic importance in relation to the Suez Canal. So that entire region was so critical for trade, which is why the British Empire was so interested in it. And the British thought that Zionist settlement in Palestine could help them achieve this long-term goal. So from the start, again, we see how Zionism and British imperialism were kind of born out of this mutual need and convenience, right? So when we talk about, later when we talk about the Nakba of 1948 and the creation of the so-called State of Israel, we need to understand that imperialism played a critical role in this. The Zionist state didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? During British colonial rule, the British actually forced Palestinians to build the infrastructures of the Zionist state, like the railways, for example. And they continue to give material and military support to Zionist militias and gangs. Okay. And that brings us, let's flash forward after World War II, as the British Empire is waning and the US empire becomes the dominant global force, right? We start to see again how Zionism plays a critical role for US imperialism. And in fact, it becomes the crown jewel at the center of US imperialist foreign policy. Today, Israel is the largest recipient of US foreign aid in the entire world and receives their unconditional support in whatever it does. So how do we explain that historically, right? So first we need to understand a little bit about the US empire. So the US has over 1,000 military bases all around the world, which means that it has units that can invade any given location on the planet in just a matter of hours, right? Israel is a critical way that the US maintains those bases in the Middle East. The US empire has the goal of nothing short of controlling the world's resources and markets and forcing its capitalist will on the entire planet, right? When we talk about like free markets and all of these things, that's what we're talking about, US imperialism. And the Middle East is especially important because, again, its strategic location and the wealth of natural resources that exist there. So we start to see how in the 60s, especially after the 60s, Israel becomes kind of the US's attack dog in the region. And it attacks countries that don't fall in line with US policy and that dare to say no to US imperialism, right? It does so on behalf of the US. And at the same time, it's furthering its goals of Zionist expansionism, right? Which means that, as we see in like 1967, trying to steal Arab lands. And by the 1970s, the US sees Israel as the primary means through which, again, this goes back to capitalism, someone mentioned, through which to combat what they call Soviet influence in the Arab world, right? But really what that means is that it's combating any attempts at self-determination by Arab people. It's combating anti-colonial projects in the Arab world. So we need to understand how from the very start, US imperialism enlisted Zionism to further the US agenda in the region. Let me just give some examples, because this is like sometimes hard to understand what this means in reality, right? So in 1967, when Israel attacked Egypt and Syria, the real reason that they did this was to defeat the socialist projects in those countries. And the US couldn't do it. Why? Because their forces were in Vietnam, again, fighting a socialist project. In 1981, Israel bombed an Iraqi nuclear power plant with US approval. This was during the Iran-Iraq war at a time when the US couldn't publicly do anything, so they sent Israel to do their bidding. In 1982, we saw how Israel invaded Lebanon with the full support of the US, and the goal of that was to crush the Palestinian resistance and to install a right-wing phalangist government. Another example is in South Africa, right? Israel was arming South Africa with the support of the US at a time when the US couldn't publicly come out in support of apartheid. Even in Chile, Israel trained the torturers of the right-wing Pinochet government. And we'll get more into this. There's more examples that we're going to talk about today, with US interests today. But just by existing as a base for the US in the region, Israel also gives the US a constant excuse to invade other countries under the guise of protecting Israel, right? So again, Israel is basically the forward operating base of American imperialism, and it helps maintain US domination over the entire region. So it's clear then that it's in the interests of the US government and Western governments to support this ethno-fascist colony and military outpost. In 1986, I'm sure this has gone around, it's come to people's attention, but Joe Biden infamously said that Israel was, quote, the best $3 billion investment we made. Whether or not there was an Israel, the US would have had to invent one. Think about that. They said the US would have had to invent an Israel, right? So I think the relationship here couldn't be clearer. And it also helps us understand why the US is currently funding a genocide without, being ashamed of it. Because the Palestinian resistance is not just a threat to Israel, but also to US imperialist interests. So again, we can see all the mental gymnastics that the Zionists and imperialists put us through. With this grounding, we can understand where that comes from and where those interests lie. From its inception to the present day, the Zionist movement has been reactionary, and it has aligned itself with capitalist, imperialist, anti-Semitic, right-wing, and fascist forces. And it's through those relations that Zionism has also sustained itself. Okay.
Okay, so understanding the Palestinian struggle through this materialist framework that Mariam discussed earlier means that we need to understand the conditions that led to this moment and historicize and contextualize the decades of colonial violence prior to October 7th. So, contrary to what mainstream media would have you believe, this didn't start on October 7th. It began over 75 years ago. The Palestinian people have been subjected to colonialism and military occupation for over 75 years. Israel is an imperialist project, which, I think is really clear, but it's also a settler colonial movement. And for 75 years, Israel has been colonizing Palestinian land, demolishing their homes, building military checkpoints and settlements, denying millions of Palestinian refugees their right to return to their homeland, and killing tens of thousands of Palestinians. The State of Israel was created through the violent displacement of nearly 1 million Palestinians in 1948, and the destruction of Palestinian villages and cities, and the massacre of Palestinian people. So the violence that we are seeing today in Gaza now is a continuation of this cumulative colonial violence that has been ongoing for 75 years, and a continuation of the deadliest and most violent year for Palestinians ever, 2023. So we discussed how Zionism is an imperialist project, and this is important for us to understand as we historicize the current war in Gaza. But we also need to understand what the Palestinians are fighting against and what they are fighting for. Just to drive that point home, the Palestinians are fighting for the liberation of their land and people, but they are also fighting against the united forces of global imperialism. So let's go back to 1948, and just again to repeat, we're going to be, there's a lot of history to discuss from 1948 and the Nakba and how it affected all of Palestine, but we're going to be zeroing in today on Gaza. So between April and December of 1948, around 200,000 Palestinian refugees took refuge in Gaza, and they came from around 49 towns and villages that were destroyed by the Zionists and who displaced their residents. These refugees were spread in 8 UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Welfare. Anyways, it's specifically UN support for Palestinian refugees. And so these camps were set up across the Gaza Strip. The camps include the Jabalia camp in northern Gaza, which is the largest of them, Al-Shati camp on the coast, the Nusayrat camp, Al-Buraish camp, Al-Maghazi camp, Deir al-Barah camp, and then Khan Yunis and Rafah in the south. So today, 70% of the people of Gaza are internally displaced refugees. And this information is critical in understanding why this 361 square kilometer strip has always been at the heart of the Palestinian struggle. Since the Nakba of Palestine until today, Gaza has represented a base of Palestinian nationalism and a source of inexhaustible resistance to the Zionist entity. So just to quickly mention this slide here just shows a lot of the towns and villages that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from in 1948, the Palestinians who were then forced to take refuge in the Gaza Strip. And as you can see, they're a short walking distance from where they are right now, but they're encaged in the Gaza Strip. So as early as 1948, just to give guys some context of the history of the resistance and popular struggle in Gaza, it began as early as 1948, where Gaza was actually the site of the first Palestinian National Conference in Gaza City. But even before that, there was popular resistance against the British occupation that was widespread in Gaza. And then in 1953, Palestinian refugees in Gaza began to organize into small guerrilla groups and carry out infiltration operations into their lands along the border. And the Israeli army responded to these infiltrations with brutal repression. And then in 1955, there was massive popular mobilization across Gaza that happened because it was an attempt to thwart a project to displace 12,000 refugees in Gaza into the Sinai Desert in Egypt. And we're seeing a similar attempt happening right now. And so these massive popular demonstrations in 1955 actually had a large impact on the July 22nd revolution led by Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. And because of this popular mobilization, he decided to organize guerrilla actions from Gaza through the formation of Palestinian guerrilla units under the command of Egyptian leader Mustafa Hafez. And it's really interesting history that we can't really get into too much right now, but Hafez led the 141st Battalion, and the operations, the resistance operations began in 1955 and inflicted heavy loss on the Israeli forces within just a few months. So this information is important to remember, because going back to our framing of remembering Zionism as an imperialist project and how it acted as a threat to Arab liberation. So because of these infiltration attempts and the massive popular demonstrations, it was incumbent upon Israel to attempt to normalize relations first with Egypt, and also declare war on countries that refuse to normalize and pursue their own path of development against the dictates of imperialism. So, in fact, the Zionist entity took part in the tripartite aggression alongside the UK and France that followed Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. And Maryam spoke a bit earlier as well about the strategic importance of Palestine and the Suez Canal to imperialist interests. So it was within the scope of this imperialist attack on Egypt that Israel in 1956 occupied Gaza for 4 months, committing several massacres that resulted in the martyrdom of over 400 Palestinians. They occupied Gaza in this period at the same time that they invaded Egypt because they wanted to stop this infiltration of Palestinian guerrillas beyond its border. So again, I'm just trying to give context to the fact that, you know, this popular resistance and mobilization against Zionism has been ongoing since the establishment of the Zionist state and even before. After the forced withdrawal of the Palestinian Revolutionary Forces from Lebanon in 1982, after the brutal three-month siege of Beirut, Gaza was once again the heart of the resistance and turned into the base for the national struggle that culminated in the outbreak of the first Palestinian Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising. And actually, the spark of this Intifada was launched from the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest refugee camp in Gaza and was also the current site of a massive bombing campaign waged by the Zionist entity yesterday and day before yesterday. I don't know if you guys have seen images of like completely destroyed residential complexes. And it's, you know, the most densely populated refugee camp, the largest refugee camp. And we're going to get into a little bit later as well about the importance of understanding how it is that, you know, Gaza is a refugee camp. It's made up of refugee camps, and even across the West Bank, refugee camps are the sites of resistance and the sites of, you know, the most violence, Zionist violence, because this is a struggle of the dispossessed are leading the struggle, and you know this is clearer than ever in who's at the heart of the struggle and who's the Zionist forces are bearing down on the most. So during the first Intifada, Gaza was such a nightmare to the Zionist regime that General Yitzhak Rabin famously wished that he could drown Gaza. Here, the quote is right there. Someone want to read it? Go ahead.
I wish I could wake up one day and find that Gaza has something to deceive.
Yeah. I've seen somewhere also the quote saying, and I sync with it too, but I couldn't find that exact quote. But this just goes to show how much of how the force of the people's struggle in Gaza and how much of a nightmare it was to the Zionist state. And it also, because of this popular resistance, General Ariel Sharon also during the second Intifada chose to quote unquote disengage from Gaza. And in this engagement, I'll get into it in a second, but this included the dismantlement of 21 settlements that were in the Gaza Strip and prior to 2000, and also the evacuation of 8,000 settlers. But let's get into disengagement framing a bit. So this disengagement framing is actually misleading, as what happened was in fact a new form of occupation, the political goal being to block the path of the establishment of any sort of Palestinian state and to perpetuate the occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem. And more specifically, this disengagement happened because Gaza began to pose a demographic threat to the Zionist entity. So what do we mean by demographic threat? Can I get a volunteer to read the quote? Go ahead. So, yeah, essentially, it was an attempt to maintain this, the ability to claim that the overall majority is 57% and enabling it to be a quote unquote Jewish state. And actually, a fun fact that Sharon had originally dubbed this disengagement plan as a separation plan before realizing that separation actually sounded kind of bad in English because it invoked apartheid. So they changed it to disengagement plan. Yeah, sorry if I'm going a little bit too fast. Is this all? Is it too fast? Okay.
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this working? Yes. So thank you, Nai. Nai really, I think, put it so well of how there has been resistance since before 1948 in Gaza. And again, just want to highlight like the concentration of refugees in Gaza is who are dispossessed from their land, who were forced after 1948 to leave their villages and go to Gaza, is one of the main reasons why we see such a strong resistance there. But we see also things shift a bit after 2005, right? So I'm just going to briefly talk about Gaza since 2005. In 2005, Israel had imposed a kind of blockade on mobility and goods in Gaza, and this would eventually really escalate in 2007. So what happens is after the Hamas movement democratically won the legislative elections of 2006 in Gaza and the West Bank, Israel and the US basically orchestrated a coup to overthrow the democratically elected Hamas party. And Hamas was able to thwart this coup in the Gaza Strip. So they weren't able to maintain it in the West Bank, but they were able to, again, become the democratically elected party in Gaza. So at that point, in 2007, Gaza was declared a, quote, hostile entity. And 3 months later, this is when we see the first large-scale war being waged on Gaza. And in this war resulted in the martyrdom of thousands of Palestinians. But the political goal of Israel, which was to destroy the resistance, really failed at this time. And it continued to fail. So since 2006, there have been 6 wars. We have 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022, and now in 2023. And in those the 5 wars before this one, there were over 5,000 martyrs in Gaza. So we see how now in 2023, that number has already far exceeded the total for all of those years. So what we're seeing today is a new destructive war in Gaza that is far more brutal than the previous ones. But again, like its predecessors, it's going to certainly fail to destroy the Palestinian resistance. So we have a short video we're going to play that talks a bit about the blockade on Gaza. Oh, video is not available. 1 second.
YouTube, just take it down.
YouTube was like, help, they're teaching it. Take it down. a link.
While we wait for this, we're gonna pull a link up. I don't know, does anyone have any questions, anything up to this point? We're gonna do like a discussion at the end, but if there's any pressing questions right now that we can maybe try to answer. I can't really, yeah, go ahead, just speak loudly if you can. For the wars? 2006, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2023, oh, and I said 2014, right? Yeah. 2022 also, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, could you say? Although the Palestinians don't have representation in the Israeli Knesset.
Yeah, I mean, so part of the logic, right, is that it's a Jewish state. So it's like a demographic thing of not being outnumbered by Palestinians, right? So you can think of it as like, so 1948 happened, the Nakba. Palestinians were expelled. A lot of Palestinians had to completely leave, and they're, were along the borders in refugee camps. But then a lot of refugees ended up in Gaza, in camps. So that area where there was a high concentration of Palestinians was basically just like closed off so that they could say like, oh, look, was it 1.4 million? Right?
Yeah, 1.4.
1.4 million people suddenly are not like part of so-called Israel.
Yeah.
So then they could maintain this demographic majority of Jews. So it doesn't have, I don't think it has to do with, I mean.
It allows them to be democratic, even though the whole premise of the Zionist entity as well as the apartheid system is, completely nullifies that. But in addition to that, in 2017, there was a nation state law that was passed, which essentially said that no matter what the exact words were, Israel is not a state for all of its citizens, it is a state for the Jewish people. So, and that is kind of in reaction to the increasing amount of Palestinians. There's like much higher birth rate amongst Palestinians. And so it's kind of foreseeing that demographic threat and trying to nullify this and this extremely horrible nation state law, which just represents what the Zionist entity is all about. Are you good? All right. Go ahead.
We're starting from 1 minute, right? Oh.
Or walking distance from Gaza.
Oh, actually.
Israel actually went on to occupy Gaza in 1967, imposed military rule on the people who lived there, and gave part of its territory to Israeli
1 minute
settlers.
and 12 seconds.
In the early 90s,
here,
it
it's good.
imposed a closure policy on Gaza. Palestinians there could no longer leave without a time-restricted, hard-to-get permit, and Palestinians from other areas were restricted from visiting Gaza as well. But it was in 2006 when things got really bad. Israel had pulled its soldiers and settlers out of Gaza the year before, while still controlling the borders, the airspace, and the economy. The Palestinian group Hamas, which has a military wing that fights the Israeli occupation, won Palestinian elections and took over Gaza. In response, Israel took its policies to the next level. The only power plant was bombed. Travel was banned. Most imports and exports were blocked, forcing most of Gaza's factories to shut down. Fishermen couldn't fish beyond a very limited area. Supplies of fuel and electricity were reduced so much that people converted their cars to run on cooking oil. Even medical supplies were restricted. The Israeli government decided how much food would be left.
All right, so that just gives, I think, some idea of what it means when we say there's a blockade, right? It's when we say a land, air, and sea blockade, you can start to understand what that means. But what we really need to emphasize is that this isn't, I think there's sometimes there's this misconception that, sanctions or blockades are like a peaceful alternative, right? That is completely false. Sanctions and blockades are an act of war, right? So they're basically holding 2.3 million Gazans hostage. They're not giving them access to fuel. They're counting the number of calories that they're allowed to ingest. They're controlling who can leave and enter Gaza. literally 90 to 95% of the water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. And since 1967, there's also been a military order imposed by the Zionist regime that states that Palestinians can't construct a water installation without receiving a permit from the Zionist state. Like, you literally can't even dig a well without getting permission. So this 17-year long blockade has been depriving Palestinians in Gaza of their basic rights. And we need to understand that this siege constitutes a blatant war crime. It's a form of collective punishment on the over 2.3 million Palestinians who live there, and we need to understand it as such. Okay.
Okay, so why is Gaza under siege? Gaza is under siege because the people of Gaza choose to resist. The people of Gaza shoulder the largest burden for our collective liberation. And when I mean collective liberation, I mean all of liberation of Palestinians, all of liberation of Arabs, and also the liberation of all oppressed people. And actually in Arabic, I like the way they frame it. They say it's for all free people instead of all oppressed people. But, you know, it's the reverse of that. But yeah, it doesn't really work in English. So no amounts of collective punishment by the Zionist entity will ever bend or break the will of our people to live in dignity and freedom on their liberated land. So Gaza, as we've discussed now, is often described as an open-air prison, which it is. The material conditions are completely unbearable. The people of Gaza are the greatest victims of the Zionist terrorist state, but they're also the greatest heroes. Gaza is not simply the site of catastrophe. Gaza is the heart of the liberation struggle, the pulse of the resistance across Palestine, and the popular cradle of the struggle. So what do we mean by popular cradle? So the popular cradle within Palestinian political literature refers to the popular base of support within Palestinian society for the Palestinian liberation struggle. The popular cradle is the organ, the beating heart by which Palestinian resistance is carried out against the Zionist entity. Israel's massacres in Gaza, as well as the total destruction of at this point, over 50% of its infrastructure, is an attempt to break and destroy the popular cradle, to destroy the beating heart of our struggle. So this approach, this Zionist military approach is best expressed in the Israel's army, what they call the Dahi doctrine, which deals with asymmetrical combat against an enemy, what they call like an enemy that is not a regular army and is embedded within a civilian population. So according to this doctrine, which was actually formed in the 2006 war on Lebanon, Israel has to employ tremendous force disproportionate to the magnitude of the enemy's actions, and here enemy means like the Palestinians. So as a result, the Dahi doctrine is an intent by Israel to target civilian infrastructure and civilians in order to apply stress and pressure on the people so that they will turn on their authorities which control the territory, or so that there no longer will be a popular cradle to incubate and support the struggle. And this picture here is from the recent bombing on the Jabalia refugee camp just the day before yesterday, and you can see like the massive destruction. New bombs used, like I don't know how many, 6 tons of bombs dropped, and there were similar pictures that I remember from Dahieh, which is the suburbs of Beirut, in 2006, which was also completely destroyed, and then this is, like I was saying, like an attempt to destroy the popular support for Palestinian struggle and resistance. So,
and sorry, just a reminder of the significance again of that specific refugee camp, which was where the first Intifada started.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
So This popular support for the liberation struggle is perhaps best embodied in the Great Return March. In 2018, Palestinians in Gaza led the Great March of Return, which was a peaceful march that included elderlies and children marching with Palestinian flags towards the illegitimate border fence surrounding Gaza. So I'll show a quick video soon, or now. Oh my God. Okay, while they get the link up, I'll give you guys some information. So the Great March of Return was a product of discussion in amongst Gaza civil society, human rights and legal activists, grassroots organizers, political faction representatives, and other civilians. And initially was conceived as only like a 6-week-long protest action that would take place on the perimeter of the Gaza Strip, but it extended much longer due to its popular character and support. And so this, it was a symbolic march meant to symbolize the right of return. So the right of return is a right that is, enshrined in international law for Palestinian refugees' right to return to their homelands, from the river to the sea. And one of the reasons that prompted this march was because, and here I'm reading a quote from one of the organizers of this march. He said that it was a collective worry that our rights as refugees were in serious jeopardy, and we must resist it in an innovative, unified, and revolutionary way. So the Great March of Return happened, and yet, even though, even now you'll hear things like, oh, why don't the Palestinians just peacefully demonstrate? Why don't they peacefully, why are they, this was the most, a very peaceful march with women and children and, I don't know. And the Israeli army, like they did, how they criminalized the BDS movement. And the Great March of Return here, they martyred over 200 Palestinians that were peacefully marching and injured 36,000. And when we say injured, this there was an adoption of a shoot to maim policy, which was essentially shooting Palestinians in their legs to disable them, and which makes it a very which puts burden on the already fragile medical infrastructure in Gaza and families' abilities to take care of them, and also the Israel viewing it as their ability to prevent them from partaking in any kind of popular resistance. Okay, and so now we'll watch the video.
في سبيل الحرية فإنسانيتك منقوصة. يعني كانت في 7 ديسمبر 2017. ففي تلك الليلة سجلت خاطرة على الفيسبوك بأنه حتى الطيور والحيوانات أكثر تصالحاً مع الطبيعة من البشر. لماذا البشر يقيموا هذه الأسيجة وهذه الأسلاك الشائكة بينهم؟ بعد حوالي شهر كتبت خاطرة أخرى كانت كالتالي: ماذا لو أن 100,000 أو 200,000 من اللاجئين الفلسطينيين في قطاع غزة قرروا في لحظة واحدة أن يزحفوا بطريقة سلمية نحو السلك العازل ويقطعوا هذا السلك العازل ويقولوا نحن نريد أن نعود إلى ديارنا ونريد الحياة ولا نريد أكثر من الحياة. ختمت هذا البوست بهاشتاج مقترح من خيالي هو مسيرة العودة الكبرى. الفلسطينيون في حالة سجن حقيقي يتعرضون للحصار، للموت البطيء. إذن لماذا لا نترك جدران السجن؟ ضمن شهر واحد فقط من كتابة هذا المنشور تحولت إلى تيار عام في المجتمع. 15 هو يوم يفترض أن يكون يوم ذروة، ولكنه ليس يوم النهاية. لماذا؟ لأننا نحن شعب نناضل في سبيل الحرية وفي سبيل الكرامة وفي سبيل تقرير المصير، فمبرر انتهاء مسيرة العودة هو تحقيق أهدافنا. هل ستتحقق بعد يوم، بعد شهر، بعد سنة، بعد 10 سنوات؟ دولة الاحتلال هذه عبء ليس على غزة وحدها ولا على الضفة وحدها ولا على فلسطينية الداخل وحدهم، هي عبء على العالم. إذا لن تكون إنسانا إلا حين تناضل في سبيل الحرية، إن لم تناضل في سبيل الحرية فإنسانيتك منقوصة.
So, an important thing to know is that the Great March of Return actually began on March 30th, which is also known as Palestinian Land Day, which is a day of remembrance for 6 Palestinians who were killed by Israeli police in 1976 while protesting the colonial theft of their lands in the Galilee region, which is Upper Palestine. So the day was specifically chosen to reaffirm the popular character of the Palestinian struggle, and that is a struggle for return to land and dignity and freedom on their own land. And so this is the significance of it being starting on Land Day.
I just wanted to add really quickly, the journalist in the video before this, his family was actually killed in this past week, and he's very seriously injured.
Okay, so this brings us to an important intervention or framing that we wanna talk about, which is central to understanding what we mean by the popular cradle. And that is, many of you have probably seen in the news or how mainstream news discussed this as, the Hamas-Israel war, even the Gaza-Israel war. And this is an attempt to separate the liberation struggle from the popular cradle that sustains the Palestinian people's resistance. This framing actually mystifies and obscures the true character of the struggle, which is that it is a war of the forces of Zionism and imperialism on the Palestinian people and their just cause for liberation, for the return to their land. The popular mass character of the struggle that has existed for over 75 years is, in this framing, reduced to a single party and dislocated from history. This framing is also used in order to, as we've seen, justify the massacres that they commit, most recently claiming that the massacre they committed in the Jabalia refugee camp a couple days ago, which resulted in the death of over 100 and the injury of over 400, was an attempt to target a Hamas leader hiding there, which they then said they didn't get. So this is not a war on a single political party. It has never been about that. This is a 100-year war on the Palestinian people, on the Arab people, and on all free people, in an attempt to control land and resources. So just again to emphasize that the popular cradle is not geographically limited to Gaza. And we have been very, like I've said from the beginning, focusing on Gaza, but we also need to kind of have a very, a cursory understanding. Maybe we can have another session where we talk about what's happening in the West Bank. And we can see that there's support rippling across Palestine, including in the West Bank, evidenced by the crackdowns that have been happening. There's been mass arrests. Now there's over 10,000 Palestinian prisoners from, many prisoners being taken from the West Bank and kidnapped off of the streets. Over 400 of which are administrative detainees, 200 of which are minors. The prisoners are prevented from accessing any medical care. They're starved. They're cut off from water and electricity. Everyone who's arrested is assaulted, and many of the prisoners beaten in their limbs and their hands, and have been subject to humiliating torture. And even in the past few days, a 25-year-old prisoner, Arafat Hamdan, was martyred by torture in the Zionist Ofer prison. And this came just 24 hours after another prisoner, Omar Daragme, was tortured to death in the Megiddo Zionist prison just a week after he was arrested in completely, good health. And of course, the Zionists are claiming that this is, just a random death, but. So in the past 3 weeks, we have seen Israel indiscriminately bomb civilians in the Gaza Strip. We have seen mass imprisonment and torture of Palestinians in the West Bank. And we have seen the displacement of thousands of Palestinians. Israel's project is to completely eliminate the Palestinian people and has reached heightened levels, as we can see in this genocidal campaign, operating on multiple fronts. They have ensured that life for any Palestinian, be it in Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, is essentially unlivable. The Palestinian people, who have for over 75 years faced the wrath of colonial violence, from home demolitions to Zionist settlements to mass imprisonment to military checkpoints to cold-blooded murders and military raids, they have the right to resist. The Palestinian people are engaged in a struggle for freedom and a fight for liberation in return, in a fight against imperialism, and therefore in a fight for all oppressed peoples or free people of this world.
So hopefully by this point, we have gotten to the heart of this question on the screen, which is, why is Gaza being attacked so viciously right now, right? All the things that we've been trying to explain right now get, again, back to our framing, back to this materialist understanding of what's going on, back to the history of the Palestinian popular resistance, back to the interrelations between Zionism and imperialism. So again, the goal of the siege and the bombings, like Nai was saying, was not to just eliminate a single party or eliminate Hamas, but to completely destroy Gaza and subject its people to a genocide. So again, going against this idealist framework that we've been seeing that's completely ahistorical of saying that, this started on October 7th. Rather, we need to understand that this is a continuation of the ongoing Zionist genocidal project, which in its own self-stated aims wants nothing short of the total elimination of the Palestinian people and expansion into Arab lands. So again, we need to think about why this isn't not just being green-lighted, but also funded by Western governments, right? And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, the relationship between Zionism and imperialism. So we need to understand that the Palestinian resistance, which when we say the Palestinian resistance, we're talking about colonized people who are rising up against their colonizer throughout all of Palestine. This Palestinian resistance, it poses a threat to imperialist interests in the entire region. So in short, we know, we can understand, and we can rationalize why the U.S. government and the ruling and capitalist classes of the West, they don't want Palestine to be free because it's simply not in their interests, right? This is, when we look at the actual history, this becomes a clear fact that we can understand, and we can understand how to be on the right side of history, right? And we're seeing how even in these conditions, the people of Gaza are resisting the occupation of their land, and they're proud of their resistance. So we're just going to show a little video. Is it going to work?
تبعتوا لنا حاملات طائرات. انتوا باللي عملتوه خلتونا فخورين بنفسنا. انا رافع راسي فوق انه كل العالم الظالم اتآمر علينا، ومش اتآمر بس بالكلمة، لا، ببعتوا صواريخ وببعتوا طيارات وببعتوا حامل تناقل طائرات وببعتوا جند وببعتوا كذا وببعتوا جيش وببعتوا استخبارات. اوف، هالقد غزة قوية؟ أنا أفتخر إني من غزة، أفتخر من هذا البلد اللي تآمرت عليه ورغم كل العالم هذا تآمر علينا وبساعد وببعت طيارات ودبابات وصواريخ أدوات البطش. أنا أفتخر إني من غزة وأرفع راسي فوق عالي إنه أنا من منطقة في يوم من الأيام كل العالم تآمر عليها وكل العالم حاربها.
Oh. Sorry, I zoned out for a second. So this video was a very powerful video, and it's just kind of driving home the point that, you know, he's saying the whole oppressive world, they're sending all of their warplanes and machines and their intelligence and their aircraft carriers, and they're doing all of this, they're conspiring all of this, you know, against us, against the 361-kilometer strip of Gaza. And, you know, it just underscores that this is a struggle of the oppressed people against the oppressive forces in the world. And, you know, that might seem like a very simplistic framing for a very, you know, complex conflict, but we know that, you know, that's what it is about. And I think, you know, it's very clear in that video. Yeah, sorry, that video is just amazing. I get flustered. So this takes us to the Arab and imperialist dimension. Everywhere that we look, there are people affected by the injustice of imperialism, and everywhere that they are affected by these injustices, you will see unconditional support for Palestine. And, you know, you can see this across all the protests happening in the globe, like we said earlier. We're seeing people throughout the rest of the Arab world specifically rise up and demand an end to the Zionist colonization of Palestine, not just because of their identification with the Palestinian cause, but because they understand that Zionism is a threat to all Arab people, and that Palestinian liberation is inherently linked to the struggle of Arabs against Zionism and US imperialism. The sheer moral force of the Arab people who have taken to the streets en masse in Yemen, in Algeria, in Lebanon, makes clear in Iraq, there's millions, makes clear that the Arab rejection of Zionism and the reactionary attempts in the Arab region to normalize with the Zionist entity, which, you know, right before in September there were you know, major kind of like moves being made for Saudi to normalize with Israel, which would have been a huge like force to support the Zionist entity. So on that note, in recent years, we have seen a concerted effort by Israel, the US, and reactionary Arab regimes like the UAE and Saudi to normalize relations with Israel, whether diplomatically, economically, militarily, or otherwise. But this moment signals the failure of the Arab normalization project, and also that it was concentrated amongst the ruling classes. It was a project of the Arab ruling class, the reactionary regimes. The Arab masses, like I said again, in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Yemen, I said that again, but the protests are just huge in Yemen. And all across the region, they reject normalization with the Zionist entity. Our people, they understand that the liberation of Palestine also means the liberation of our region from the shackles of Zionism and imperialism. And it secures the self-determination of our land and our people. We have also seen how Israel has posed a consistent military threat to Arab countries. We cannot overlook that Israel has historically attacked Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan with the aim of capturing more territory for the expansionist, colonialist Zionist project. Today, Israel still occupies the Syrian Golan Heights and occupies parts of southern Lebanon and lots of parts of Lebanon 2000, and still occupies the Shib'a farms in southern Lebanon. It consistently, in line with US foreign policy aims, thwarts Arab liberation throughout the region, attacking the Lebanese border, supporting the imperialist Saudi US-backed war on Yemen, which very clearly backfired on them, posing a threat to Iran, enabling mass murder in Syria. At this moment, Israel is not just bombarding Gaza, but it's also carrying out missile strikes in Lebanon and Syria. The fronts of the Zionist war extend far beyond Palestine, and that is just the nature of a settler colonial imperialist project. The Zionist project even extends beyond the Arab world, constituting a threat, as we've said like a million times, but a threat to all oppressed people and movements worldwide. Like we discussed at the beginning, again, there are numerous instances of Zionist intervention across the world. In the early decades after its creation, Israel had few friends in Africa and Asia. Israel sought to break through this isolation by forging close ties with other settler colonial states like South Africa and Rhodesia, and right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America and Africa. It supplied arms, intelligence, and military training to these countries. And this is why, as Ghassan Kanafani, a revolutionary Palestinian intellectual, said that the Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, wherever they are, as a cause of the exploited and oppressed masses in our era.
And since it's a cause for everyone, this also explains why the mainstream Western media is waging an ideological war against anyone who dares to stand up for Palestinian liberation. And we need to be clear about the role that the mainstream media plays, right? They are basically a mouthpiece for American capitalist interests. So to start off this section of the teach-in, where we're shifting to our role here in the US, does anyone have any examples that they remember of some of the really appalling headlines that we've seen recently? You don't have to, quote it or anything. Unless you have a photographic memory, that's cool. Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the misinformation about beheading babies.
Yeah, I was saying the misinformation about Hamas beheading babies and other people.
I feel like closer to the 7th, I heard a lot of Israel under attack, kind of narrative.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention all of the passive voice in a lot of these headlines, this and this was bombed, but who dropped them,
Yes, exactly. That I'm gonna go from there because that actually is exactly what we want to talk about in the example that we have. One of the really striking moments of when we're seeing this kind of coverage was the coverage of the criminal Zionist airstrikes on Al-Ahli hospital that killed over 500 Palestinians. And these were people who were injured in a hospital and were taking refuge there, right? Let's be clear. So what we saw, this is an example from the New York Times. At first, they reported Israeli strike kills hundreds in hospital, Palestinians say, right? It's not even reported as it's just, and then they quickly retracted that. They said, use this passive voice, right? At least 500 dead, they said. At least 500 dead in strike on Gaza hospital. And then it's not in this image, but unfortunately I get newsletters from the New York Times for work, and they had sent, who did it kind of thing when all the stuff was coming out, where Israel was saying that this was a misfired rocket. Then they called it, instead of a strike, they called it a blast, right? This is where we see that part of the misinformation come in, that this was a misfired rocket and just a blast. That like you said, there's this passive voice that's used that completely whitewashes Zionist crimes, and at the same time doesn't, give any sense of full humanity to Palestinians, right? And this coverage is not just limited to this moment or to the current assault on Gaza. This has been the case for over 75 years. For over 75 years, the media and the Western governments have been totally committed to whitewashing the colonial Zionist states' crimes against our people. For 75 years, they've been ignoring this colonial violence that has resulted in the murder and dispossession of Palestinians. So what we're seeing right now is selective outrage from the media, right? So there's, we didn't see any condemnation of any of the crimes that Israel has carried out. right? Where was the condemnation when the Israeli finance minister called for a genocide on Hawara, right? He called for that publicly. And that resulted in the burning of numerous Palestinian homes and business. There was no outcry. No one said anything, right? There was no outcry when over 200 Palestinians were killed by the occupation forces before this, just since the start of 2023. There was no outcry when Netanyahu blatantly pointed to a map at the General Assembly of the UN and called for a greater Israel, right? He said, the project is so clear, like they say it, but none of this is reported. None of this is reported. There's total amnesia around the Zionist crimes against Palestinians. And at the same time, we see this kind of rhetoric that's being pushed that is dehumanizing Palestinians to manufacture consent for genocide and for the erasure of Gaza and its people. It uses, the media, we've seen how they've used racist tropes, they've put unverified claims, right? Using the term terrorist, this kind of thing, to greenlight the endless wars of aggression that have resulted now in, as we said before, the martyrdom of over 8,000 Palestinians in Gaza so far. And it's also reached us here in the US. A 6-year-old boy in Chicago was murdered by his landlord for being a Palestinian Muslim. These things are enabled by the media. But this isn't just a rhetorical or discursive thing, right? We need to understand that there is a material basis for this dehumanization, right? We can't just chalk it up to like media bias or anti-Arab sentiment in the media. These are symptoms of what's happening. The root causes of why the media can portray Palestinians and Arabs in this way are because of the settler-colonial relation in Palestine, right? The racism and dehumanization that we're seeing have their basis in that, in the fact that the Palestinian people are colonized, that their land and resources are being stolen, and that it's in the interests of the United States for this to remain the case, right? So this is an ideological battlefield right now. Palestinians are being portrayed as less than human. They're being portrayed as terrorists, as savages. And the Israelis, on the other hand, are being portrayed as defenders of democracy or protecting themselves. And this ideological battlefield is a critical component of the war on Gaza right now. The media is complicit in this. And it's discursively justifying the material colonial relationship or relation that Palestinians are in currently. So that is part of why it is our duty here in the US to combat this narrative. We need to combat it actively and insistently. And when people say, oh, why are you sharing, whatever, like sharing doesn't do anything. Yeah, okay. We're not saying don't share. Share and do other things too, right? But we need to combat this narrative. And like I said, we also have a bigger role to play, right? As we know, the US provides billions of dollars of military aid to Israel. It's funding the genocide right now. And we demand that the United States end its complicity in enabling and providing military funding for the senseless massacres that we're seeing committed against Palestinians in Gaza right now. This is an example of Israeli weapons that are manufactured and basically tested on Palestinians and then sold around the world. And what we're seeing in Congress right now is a battle to continue this situation. Right now there's Joe Biden proposed aid package that would give $100 billion in U.S. aid to Israel and Ukraine. And as working people in this country who are plagued with the ills of capitalism, who have no funding for healthcare, no funding for public education or childcare or housing, we're seeing how Congress is giving a blank check for a war. Our tax dollars are directly funding the destruction of homes in Palestine and the murder of Palestinians. All right.
So historically and today, the diaspora has played a very pivotal role in the popular mobilization. You know, it's easy to feel super disconnected, but I'm always watching the news from back home and like seeing how much they cover protests across the world. Like, you know, it's very clear that it's a source of material, I mean, of moral support and courage to you know, the Palestinian liberation struggle. And you know, just like this, it's a moral support, the least that we can do to stand up in the diaspora. And it's for all those who support the liberation and justice for Palestine. And you know, it is our duty to rise up in this moment of courage and to join our voices with people all around the world to break free from the shackles of colonialism. So to that end, we hope you're all going to join us on DC on November 4th, where we will march to the White House to voice our demands, which are fourfold. We demand an immediate ceasefire and the end to the genocide, the current genocide campaign on Gaza. But that doesn't stop there. We demand an end to the US government's complicity, including funding, weapons sales, and political impunity for the Zionist state. And we demand that the 17-year-long brutal siege on Gaza be lifted. And finally, we demand a free Palestine. And we know that we're not gonna get that from the US Congress, but that is why we need to continue to mobilize, we need to continue to organize, we need to continue to march, you know, after November 4th, until Palestine is liberated from the river to the sea and all refugees can return. Thank you. So now we're gonna do we'll have a 20-minute or however long discussion. 15-minute discussion. The Miss is gonna pass around the microphone and okay, yeah. So you guys can go ahead or wait for the microphone actually. And we might have some other Palestinian Youth Movement members jump in to answer some questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. This was extremely illuminating, first of all. Second, I feel like while I understand a lot, I feel like I'm still not clear on like why it's called the popular cradle. If you could answer that for me.
So I think just to put it kind of shortly, you know how we started off discussing how the Gaza Strip makes up 70%, is made up 70% of refugees. In the West Bank, for instance, also you see Jenin, it's a refugee camp, the Jenin camp in Nablus, in Tul Karam. Those are the sites of continuous Zionist incursions and also resistance. And they're also the sites of, you know, the masses of the displaced. And so the framing, the idea of the popular cradle is that it signifies the popular base of support for Palestinian liberation. It's not, you know, the resistance struggles, whether it's a March of Return or other, you know, popular resistance that we're seeing is not disconnected from the will and the desire of the Palestinian people, and it takes on a popular mass character. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers it fully, but it's someone else doing. We can also talk afterwards. Yeah, we'll take a couple questions and then.
Hi, my question is about when you mentioned like how they moved people to Gaza to like change the numbers? Are there a lot of Palestinians living in the place that's called Israel now, and like what's life like for them?
I'm sorry, just to clarify, you're talking about, you're asking what it's like for Palestinians who live in what is now called Israel? Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead. We'll take a couple questions.
Okay. And could you also please touch on the Oslo peace talk and a little bit more information on Israeli army pulling out of Gaza in early 2000? Because, you know, Hillary Clinton came out and saying Palestinians are ungrateful because U.S. tried to help with all these peace talks that were rejected. So if we can address that a little bit.
Oh, my question was about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I feel like a lot of Zionists or people feel very confused by that and will say, okay, that means that, you know, you're trying to completely get rid of Israel and it's a violent statement. What do you guys think about that discussion and kind of explaining to people that that's not at all what it means? In a way that's more eloquent than maybe I could come up with. I would love to hear that. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Let's just take them and then,
Hi, that was basically exactly my question, but I wanted to know more if you guys could just elaborate on what y'all's idea of from the river to the sea means and what returning land to Palestine looks like.
I don't know if you guys are gonna remember this by now, but not to get bogged down by semantics, but I think I just maybe like another clarification on like how we differentiate the ideological and materialistic framework, because you brought up the idea that it's an ideological battlefield, like with media and how we talk about it now. So it's like, how do we talk about it to other people and keep it simple and remind them that this is about materials, while also kind of protecting like the ideology of the Palestinian people and humanizing them.
Good evening, everyone. My question was from a First Nation African and also a First Nation North American, watching the strategies be made and precedent at every turn of colonialism and imperialism. How can we show easily the timeline of the people who have for thousands or hundreds of years been able to use the same strategy over and over? Who are their families? Where their monies come from? How we right now always, besides tax dollars, giving them our money and supporting them, and how can we then stop that support and stop genocide worldwide?
Okay, I think we have more questions than we can cover in 10 minutes. Yeah, let's go for it. We can try to.
You mentioned that part of the motivations for trying to seize this land are the materials that it offers or the resources that are in the land. I'm just curious as to what those are, like oil or like natural resources, and what maybe the economy of Palestine before was dependent on.
Before answering everyone's question, I just want to, say great questions, and also that it kind of indicates that there's a thirst for more knowledge. We really, like I said, honed in on very specific history and framing to help everyone, understand this moment. But we hopefully will be able to, we did sessions before on the Oslo Accords and on the first Intifada and resistance under the British occupation and the contemporary moment. Hopefully we'll get to do these again and kind of more comprehensively answer your questions, which I don't know if I'll be able to do that well right now. But with that,
do you want to
take it away? Which one should we start with? Okay, I'll kind of start backwards because it's in my mind. The question on the materialist and idealist framing and how that has to relate with, the ideological battle. I think, part of what we were trying to emphasize is that it's an ideological battle, but it has material interest in the sense that, to put it very vulgarly, Israel and the US, they need to dehumanize the Palestinians in order to justify bombing them. They need to dehumanize them in order to justify taking their land. Like even, the founding Zionist myth that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land. It's an idealistic framing, but it's rooted in, the desire to steal the land and claim the resources. So it's not, we need to understand it not just like, the reason we push back against like an idealistic framing is that in some senses it also doesn't really give us solutions. If you just say, oh, this is the way because they just hate us, or they just, it's just a timeless conflict, or it doesn't give you any ways to actually combat this. Whereas if you see it in a materialist framework and you see kind of like what are the driving factors behind it, it kind of enables you to have more solutions.
Just add to that, just a quick I hope that there wasn't confusion about this, but when we say idealist or idealism, it doesn't mean the same thing as ideology. So when we say an idealist framework, it just means that the explanation starts out from the realm of ideas, right? So we have this idea, Muslims are terrorists. Like this is an idea, right? It's not, so then we're saying, okay, we need to look at what are the actual conditions that exist that make that idea come about, right? So we see the colonization of Palestine. I'm just trying to give a quick example, but I just wanted to say that ideology means something different, right? Yeah. Maybe we can go to Oslo.
Yeah.
Let's do Oslo.
So the Oslo Accords is like a whole 5-part session, but to try to sum it up, what we saw in the quote-unquote peace talks, which we view as a capitulationist project, because it essentially went from it took the national liberation struggle and made it into a kind of state building project that was in collusion with the Zionist entity. And we can see that in the way that the Palestinian Authority is involved in security coordination, what they call security coordination with the Zionist state. And you can see that also in the way that the Oslo Accords actually, it kind of dislocated the entire diaspora from the Palestinian struggle. And that's, to bring it back to the Palestinian youth movement, we see that what the Oslo Accords did was dismantle Palestinian institutions across the world and also kind of dislocate the Palestinian diaspora, whether it's in the refugee camps in Lebanon and in Syria and Jordan, or the far diaspora over here and across the world from the Palestinian struggle, from the national liberation struggle. Essentially, after the Oslo Accords, also settlements in the West Bank only increased. Now you have 500,000 settlers in the West Bank. You have continued encroachments. You have, like Mariam mentioned earlier, pogroms in the Hawara. 2021, we saw in Sheikh Jarrah. There is mass arrests without charge of Palestinian youth. And these are just the consequences of the Oslo Accords. But
yeah, I think do you want to go for it? But yeah, the other thing to know about the Oslo Accords, I think someone mentioned the Palestinians weren't grateful for the peace process. there's no peace, right? Like there's no peace process. The popular will of the Palestinian people was not to have the Oslo Accords, right? What we need to remember is that the Oslo Accords were they were a class project. They were a bourgeois project. And it was the interests of the Palestinian businessmen that really drove the Oslo Accords. So their interests, again, they were tied to Western capitalism. They were tied to Israel in a lot of ways. Like, you know, we have the example of the cement contractors that make money off of the occupation, right? Like, so again, this state building project that came out of Oslo, it was good for business. It was good for the creation of a bourgeois state where your interests are protected legally, through markets. But it's not good for the Palestinian people. So and it was never supported popularly, right? It was actually seen, like Nai said, as a capitulation.
Yeah, it went directly against the popular cradle. You know, they rode, the people who carried out the Oslo Accords rode on the wave of the first Intifada and the popular mobilization and hijacked it in order to take over the popular will for liberation and, you know, funnel that into a bourgeois state project, which has not and can never result in true liberation. So, I mean, well, the question on from the river to the sea and you know, what we think about that, I think it's very simple what from the river to the sea means. It means return and liberation. Return to the lands that the Palestinians still have the keys to the homes, you know, and liberation from the structure of colonialism and colonial violence that governs Palestinian lives from Gaza, the West Bank, to historic Palestine, or what is called Israel by the Zionists. And the return of refugees from Lebanon, from Syria, from Jordan, from all over the world. And yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty simple, but
related to the question about like the, you know, Zionists, why they want to seize land and things like that. Like, first of all, it's a settler colonial project. So the land is like really important. Stealing the land is key, right? But there's also key resources. So for example, in 1967, when, you know, Israel occupied Sinai, again, it was because of the importance of the Suez Canal. Or the Golan Heights, it's like a critical resource or area for water resources. It's like one of the most important water resources in that entire region. So all of these things are strategic, and it's not just strategic for the settler colonial project, but like for the advancement of U.S. interests in those regions, right? To have bases with those resources. And then when we think about the region more broadly, like, yeah, of course, oil is critical. You know, the Middle East has like the most oil reserves in the world, and control over those resources and those markets means basically controlling the fuel that runs the globe. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
There's also, whoever asked that question, come to me afterwards. It's a pretty good video that I've watched recently that explains this, but you know, it's also, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, like sits on the Mediterranean Sea, right? Which, you know, is the Suez Canal, but also a very important site for trade to go from all the way from China on into Europe and then to North America. And so the ports of Syria, of Lebanon, of Palestine are very important ports, and that can also help you understand sort of, I don't know how much whoever asked the question knows about like the what's been going on in the region for the last like 20, 30 years, but essentially all of the ports, except for the port of Haifa in Palestine, are out of business. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, so I'm really sorry because there's some really good questions that we didn't get to, but it's 8, and I actually have a meeting to go to related to all of this. So I don't want to cut it off here. If you still have questions, I would really encourage you to approach any PYM member. Can PYM members just like raise their hand, look around the room? People who want to answer questions, or, you know, yes. Don't approach me. I'll be on Zoom. But yeah, sorry. Approach any POM member with questions. And also, like, we're going to keep track of these questions, and hopefully we are going to be able to teach more of these in the future and build off of the questions that people still have. So we're going to close out here. Thank you. Thanks again to the People's Forum. Thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see you on Saturday. Yeah.